I'm Jim Pinkerton.
I'm Dave Weigel, and obviously there were discussions that broke down over which was going to introduce the other first. But I'm Dave Weigel of the Washington Independent, shortly of the Washington Post.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton at Fox News and the New America Foundation and wherever else. So, and we're here together to talk about, I guess, mostly the healthcare bill, which seems to be the gift that keeps on giving in terms of news value.
Oh, I was going to say, for which party does it keep on giving? For the fourth estate, it's fantastic.
I mean, for example, the New York Times this morning, the very distinguished healthcare reporter Robert Pear has a piece about, so you thought that the Obamacare bill covers pre-existing conditions. Read the fine print, and it quotes William Schiffbauer, who was an insurance company lawyer, as saying, "Look, we know what the politics of this is, that you covered all pre-existing conditions, but actually the fine print says we don't have to do it for another 3.5 years until January 2014."
Well, it's children who are covered first, right? That's always the safe thing.
Well, no, it's not. It's not children, because there's a case in Texas where a baby was born, I think, on March 15th by the name of Houston Tracy, although the baby was born in Dallas, was born with his arteries in his heart transposed, which is obviously a very serious and lethal condition. And so the doctors, to their great credit, operated on the kid. And then the parents were told that the Blue Cross of Texas won't cover them. So and ABC says it doesn't kick in for 6 months, and so ABC News says 6 months away. The New York Times says 3 years and 9 months away. Again, people like us will keep busy trying to sort this out if we can.
Well, I'm mostly convinced by the idea that this will be good for Democrats in the long run, because failing to pass a bill would have been bad for them. That was a movie we've seen before, and they failed in '93 and got no credit. But this sounds like the other argument that I'm hearing from Republicans and finding pretty convincing, that now that the government, everyone who reads the paper glancingly thinks that the government now runs healthcare somehow, right? I mean, if you're right wing or if you're left wing, you think that Barack Obama has some ownership. So everything that goes wrong now, you can pin on the government, and everything you don't understand, you can pin on the government too. And certainly that's my experience with healthcare, is I understand very little of it. Before I thought it was all my business. Now things like this, I'm going to wonder who's to blame for my tiny baby not being covered by this.
Obama was supposed to fix it. This could be a situation where, in a weird way, and I know probably in game theory this isn't possible. Both parties are helped, because look, the Republicans have the issue now. They've got the grievance. Every sparrow that drops, healthcare wise, can be blamed on the people who voted for the bill. And on the other hand, the Democrats can say, look, conservatives have been saying for the last year that this wasn't a healthcare plan, this was a voter registration plan, and that these 30 million people getting healthcare coverage are going to be duly noted and registered into the Democratic ranks. Now, again, who knows? It would seem, though, that if you're writing 2,800 pages of legislation, and more to the point, signing that into law, and now you're writing 15,000 pages of rules and regulations to go with that, that there are going to be a lot of bombshells to come as we discover, what company is getting shafted, or what company is getting helped, or which medical marijuana provision is got stuck in there that nobody knows about, and which sex change operation is being paid for. The blogosphere is going to eat up all of those revelations as they come, and I can think of.
Well, that's what happened with the stimulus. I think, generally speaking, let's just limit it to, there are states that have more federal employees on the payroll than they would have had there not been a stimulus, just as they took that money and put it in. Let's say everything else failed, they did that. But because of blogs and because of the way reporting works, I think there's more awareness of the fact that there are bogus congressional districts that got money, or that various pieces of pork that Tom Coburn was able to find in there were part of it. And I wonder if that's what we're going to see now too, is just death by a trillion cuts reporting on the things here that aren't working.
Right, or the things that are working at the advantage of some special interest. In other words, again, if the moment, I guess, when this really became an observable phenomenon was the Dan Rather story about George W. Bush in, I think, September 2004, about, where these memos that sort of seemed to document that he had sort of, not been, he got a special deal with the Texas Air National Guard. And, of course, he did get a special deal with the Texas Air National Guard, but not as documented in these memos. They're pretty quickly demonstrated to be fakes. And what happened was 100 or 1,000 different bloggers, each of whom had a little tiny piece of information about, fonts and typewriters and justification and kerning and all these phrases that we learned so quickly, 5.5 years ago, within days demonstrated, I think, to everybody but Dan Rather's satisfaction that the memos were fakes. And it cost Dan Rather his job at CBS and permanently established this sort of pajama community of self-selected experts on things. And I guarantee across America today, 100,000 people who are not on any journalistic payroll are reading this healthcare bill, either because they're doing it for some company or they're just doing it out of their own zeal.
This is actually, I don't want to abandon the healthcare topic, but I do think this is an underrated advantage conservatives have had. That any transparency in general is good for people who don't trust government, because there's not many industries that would benefit if you were able to open up all the books and film what people were doing and file a legal request and see all their information without them getting sued, like we're able to do with FOIA. But generally speaking, it's very easy to find things that aren't working with the government program, and I've noticed this for a while. Conservatives can agree on this sort of good government argument that the more that we can know about what our tax dollars are up to, the better. And liberals go along with that because it's a good government argument. They like those sorts of things. But it's really hard to think of an example of a federal program being exposed to oversight and becoming more popular.
Well,
that's not going to change. Like, we're going to have more and more availability, more and more access. The stimulus really, as it became unpopular, became so because libertarians and other libertarians set up their own stimulus watchdog site. I'm trying to think of other things. Everyone is using recovery.gov to find stories.
Right. Everybody could write a story discovering the mythical 144th congressional district in their state, and recovery.gov was obviously a deeply mismanaged program on top of a deeply mismanaged stimulus, gave them all the fodder they needed. It's an interesting argument to just pause over for a second. Does the blogosphere give, as it were, the defense the advantage? Are we in one of those situations like in World War I where the people with machine guns and barbed wire have the advantage over cavalry and infantry? And you might be right. Strictly speaking, in March of 2010, you are right. The question is, do the forces of offense, if you will, the forces that want government programs to work, have any tools that might be available to them to make their offense work better?
They basically have presidential persuasion, whatever that's worth, and they also have, if there are benefits to this that trigger at any time, if there are 25-year-olds who now can get health insurance that they couldn't get before, I guess that's good for them. But generally speaking, let's think of the New Deal and the Great Society. Both of those times, there wasn't really good accounting for what something would cost. And there wasn't good accounting once it went into effect. Generally speaking, there was graph that you can't get away with anymore. Tons of it in the New Deal. Less so in the Great Society, but the Great Society was more that just people did the calculations wrong and didn't figure it out for years later. So you can't do that anymore. And I've thought this whole time. It makes the great social democratic project a lot harder to undertake. I'm interested to watch them try and get away with it. And I know they're frustrated. I mean, there's a lot of anger about that. I just keep bringing back the district story because there's something of a point there. The money was allocated to various states. It just that bureaucrats wrote down the wrong congressional districts when they filed the reports. But that kind of stuff, I mean, that's going to keep happening with healthcare in a much more serious way. It's one thing to worry about whether your tax money was wasted on some district. It's another to worry about a horror story of a healthcare being denied. And the one you said was pretty horrifying. But healthcare being denied anywhere. Anytime that comes up and it percolates, it's going to be damaging.
Of course, the perversity of the Texas. I want to come back to this issue about the vulnerability of big government to the little pinpricks of a million little Gullivers, to mix all sorts of metaphors. The final irony on this case of the baby born in Texas whose family was denied coverage from Blue Cross for $267 a month. That was the check. They cashed the first check and then said, no, we're not covering him. And then it turns out the family then went to the Texas State Insurance Pool and got on the Texas State Insurance Pool policy for $277 a month, $10 more. And in the course of applying and being accepted into the Texas Insurance Pool, this is all per ABC News, they discovered that the people they were applying to were Blue Cross. Blue Cross manages the Texas Insurance Pool for the state of Texas. And so apparently for the privilege of having the plan purchased through the state of Texas as opposed to Blue Cross, the family in question pays $10 a month more. But they're still covered. I mean, it does sort of remind one that for all the argument we've had about health insurance and who gets covered and who doesn't get covered and who should and who shouldn't and mandates and so on, everybody one way or another in this country gets covered. That's not a particularly libertarian point, but it is if you can present yourself to the media and you have a cute baby who's going to die unless it gets a heart operation, very few people the side of Ayn Rand are going to say no. Nobody should pay for it.
Well, the Democrats are obsessed with saying that they're not going to be. Well, people will be happy when they learn there are no death panels. Is that from your reading of this? That's basically true, right? I mean, there's no one who's going to be rationed to death by the government.
Well, we'll see.
In the next
we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, the Washington Post is on a little tear this morning. Bob Samuelson, distinguished columnist, and Fred Hyatt, the editorial page editor, both are going after Obamacare on deficits and spending. It would appear that the Washington establishment has given Obama a pass, as it were, to enact this health care bill because it's just so important, to Democrats, and the establishment is half Democratic or 2/3 Democratic, however you want to just define it. And so they're saying, look, we've got to let the Democrats have this bill. It's just so important to, lefty bloggers and so on. So they'll never be happy unless we give it to them. And then once it passes, we're going to come down on them and say, look, budget cuts, budget cuts, budget cuts. And Obama appears to have been saying nice things to this establishmentarian group about budget cuts. And created this deficit panel, the Simpson, whoever it was, I've forgotten the Democrat, Simpson and some.
We'll either forget him now or forget him later.
Right. Well, in any case, the point is Obama is playing ball with these people, and so now they're going to say, listen, you've got to bend the curve. The healthcare, by almost all accounts, the healthcare curve bent upwards, not downwards, as a consequence of the Obamacare bill that was signed into law last week. So now start bending it down again. So at that point, you tell me 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, if the Democrats see it as their goal to shrink the share of healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP, you tell me what they're going to do.
How they're going to start doing it?
Yeah.
I'll talk to. I like to talk to Republicans about how they expect the country to come around to shrinking entitlements, and it's a lot of magical thinking. It's a lot of hope that when things become really awful, and right now we see reports that Social Security is going broke a bit faster than we expected. When things become really awful, then everyone's just going to come around in a great national cause and agree to fix it. But that's what Democrats thought was happening with health care. Everyone agreed there was a problem, and that we had to band together and take some lumps and fix it. I don't know what they ever cut. Honestly, we're at this point where conservatives don't really want to get more. Well, the conservatives believe that you can get more revenue by cutting taxes. Let's leave that aside. They never want to increase any tax, but they don't want to take another political hit by cutting anything. I really don't know when this comes due. If they're like, I guess the libertarian experiment that Brick Lindsay and some other people engaged in was pretty flawed, pretty fatally flawed from inception. But if there were libertarians embedded within this governing coalition, they might have some friendly conversations about huge, wasteful government operations that we get rid of. I mean, Democrats, they should be all for cutting the Department of Homeland Security. They should be for devolving some of the operations of the Department of Education, but they're just not going to. Their interest groups aren't good. I think that their best hope, really, well, not their best hope, but the best hope for a Democratic Party that doesn't do that is for union membership to continue to decline, so that interest group no longer has as much power to keep everything in this stasis.
Well, of course, I mean, I think that the unions may disappear, but I think that AARP isn't going anywhere. I think that
they're going to get larger.
They're going to get larger, right? If the number of senior citizens is currently about 39 million in America, and it's going to be 89 million in 2050, that's a lot of folks. I must say that on the Brink Lindsay libertarian thing, which was an article he wrote in the New Republic, 5 years ago. 5 years ago. I actually think he was onto something, but in the sense that the elites in Washington, don't really disagree on a lot of things. So they actually kind of agree on entitlement controls, and they kind of agree on abortion and gay marriage and stuff like that. They sort of liberal libertarians, I call left libertarians, sort of say we should have national health insurance, but it shouldn't do very much. And then they say, now let's go back to talking about gay marriage and abortion. And conservative libertarians, Cato Institute libertarians, say let's not have national health insurance, and they regret it passing. But now let's talk about abortion and gay marriage. So I find it sort of the case that the elites have sort of agreed, and on a lot of things here inside the Beltway and in New York and the Bay Area and wherever else. And what they really agree on is that the peasants are getting too much. Which is why we have to cut entitlement spending, not for them, but for the folks out there beyond the Beltway, and which makes me think that death panels may yet make a comeback.
The left is driven crazy by this. The new bloggy left despises this fact about Washington, that Robert Samuelson is allowed to exist and to write these things, or that there's actually a lot of anger about Pete Peterson's various projects and the Fiscal Times. You remember the pushback?
Right now, is the Fiscal Times still part of the Washington Post?
I think because to dial it back, when the Fiscal Times is this newspaper launched by Pete Peterson, I think he's letting it operate independently, but its focus is definitely on informing the American public that we're in a long-term entitlement crisis, which might, according to a liberal economist, get people motivated to cut some of these entitlements. So they ran that one piece with the Fiscal Times, and then there was a huge pushback from liberal economists to liberal bloggers to cut the relationship. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not there yet. I don't know what the current relationship is.
Okay, that was quite a stink 2 or 3 months ago, and
they haven't run anything since then.
Okay, so anyway, it is worth pointing out that right now Social Security is about 4% of GDP in 2010. In 75 years, it'll be 6% of GDP, which strikes me as kind of manageable, going from 4 to 6. Now, on the other hand, Medicare and Medicaid are going to go from 4% of GDP or 5% or 6% to like 20 or 25 in the next 100 years. So there is a crisis there. But the crisis is healthcare, not Social Security. And so it is. I always say to people, look, talk about entitlements is great, but don't say Social Security and Medicare are the same thing, because they're not. Social Security is not. It may be going larger than the trust fund according to the FICA tax, but it is not ballooning out of control. Social Security will not turn us into Greece.
Right.
Medicare and Medicaid might, although whenever I read stories about babies in Texas that need expensive operations, I am reminded that actually people kind of like health care, and if people like it, maybe they ought to get it. That's my libertarian thought.
But one thing we learned from the healthcare debate was that when the Republican Party's best rhetorical weapon, apart from death panels, is that it's going to cut Medicare.
The Democrats are going to cut Medicare.
The Democrats, that's what I mean.
Right.
That the party in power is going to cut Medicare, and that if you give Mitch McConnell more senators, he's going to make sure nobody ever takes away Medicare Advantage. Then that gives you, I think, reasons for suicidal pessimism about whether one of these parties is ever going to tackle that. So yeah, for all the DC establishment agreeing on this concept, there really isn't any appetite with the political class, and I think liberal bloggers get annoyed at again Samuelson writing or Pete Peterson writing, but that's the thing they're winning on all the time. I mean, Matt Iglesias and the rest of these guys are completely in line with the Democratic Party and half at least the Republican Party's political operation when they say don't ever touch entitlements and let's just pretend we can deal with this later at some point as we expand everything else.
Right.
And then that's going to I think that's one reason the establishment in D.C. has come around to, not all of it, I don't want to make a blanket statement like that, but there's much more coverage of the Tea Parties right now, and that irritates liberals. It's because, it's heartening for some people in D.C. to see this tremendous concern for the long-term deficit coming from heartland America.
So you're saying that the establishment needs the Tea Partiers to outflank the Democratic and Republican political establishments?
I think so.
That's interesting. That's actually kind of that would, if Pete Peterson is really thinking like that, or Fred Hyatt or whoever, then I'm not sure. I'm joking, but the point is, right? If because the political class, no practicing politician, wants to vote to cut Medicare, and every Democrat who voted for, including Medicare Advantage, which is a sort of a semi-private augmentation to Medicare that was passed as part of the Prescription Drug Act 7 years ago. So every Democrat who voted for the Obamacare and therefore for $500 billion in cuts in Medicare over the next 10 years is going to feel vulnerable to some direct mail piece from his Republican challenger on this. And so therefore, the political class is not going to want to vote for this stuff. And so maybe, the Peterson Foundation and the Tea Partiers need each other to put the squeeze on the incumbentocracy.
I think so. I mean, Cato is not an organization that does a lot of hanging out with the hoi polloi and looking to the heartland for proof that their ideas are validated, because their ideas are usually not validated politically at all. But yeah, they've definitely jumped onto this in a way they haven't before. And I don't know. Let's see how successful this is. But the last time we had a policy sea change, and it didn't last long, was when everyone agreed in 1992 and 91, 92, 93, there was enough agreement that we needed to raise taxes to start cutting the deficit. And indeed, that happened. And then there was a huge political backlash, like there might be if we actually cut, start to make healthcare cuts.
There was enough agreement among the elites, among the Concord Coalition crowd in 1991 and 92 and 93. And then the people who did it got beat, right?
They did, okay. But in that interim, they're convinced that this big Perot vote out there was most concerned. I mean, he did say he would do anything it took to cut the deficit. So I think that there was this political space created that might happen again. And certainly, I think Obama, for all the talk of how radical he is, I think he'd be totally willing to sell out the liberal base in order to get reelected if he was in a position where he had to start looking at some entitlement cuts. I mean, Clinton was in a position to do that in 1988 and abandoned it because he needed support for impeachment. But I think the Democratic base is so terrified of losing power again that he would get away with it. But I mean, yeah. Well, actually, I want to move on a bit because speaking of DC elites, I guess it's sort of petered out. Maybe it's been overtaken by other news, but this is the think tank world has been rocked in a way it's not usually rocked by David Frum leaving AEI, and
or being asked to leave AEI, depending on how you read it.
The fact we know that that he is no longer working for AEI. We do not know the sequence of events and arguments that led up to that. But you're at a think tank. I think you're calling me.
I'm at the New America Foundation, look, Frum has. I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal, put it well. David Frum has become the go-to person to go-to conservative to bash conservatives, and that's a sort of the role carved out, decades ago by Kevin Phillips, who was this a brilliant political thinker of the '60s, who then increasingly became alienated from the Republican Party, which he had helped with the Nixon campaign in 1968, and has spent much of the last 30 or 40 years saying, I'm a Republican, I hate Republicans. And needless to say, the mainstream media ate it up. Now, Phillips has gotten old, and his act, if you will, has gotten old. He is a brilliant guy. I'm not taking that away from him. He has a right to think what he thinks. But the cynicism by which the New York Times or CBS would say, tell us, Mr. Phillips, what's wrong with Ronald Reagan or George Bush, became a little thick. David Frum seems to have picked up that role a little bit, which means he's got a great career ahead of him.
Phillips started to go off book, and it was the last book, American Theocracy. I mean, he just started to make arguments that were a bit bigger than which party's going to win political space that most of our debates happen in. Whereas Frum is still there. I mean, everything Frum writes is about what it will take for the Republicans to elect more people.
Right. Although he seems to have a unique slant on Republicans that only he and a few people at the Frum Forum share. I mean, the idea that Republican political fortunes would have been improved by negotiating and splitting the difference with the Obamans on health care, for example. It's hard to find a partisan Republican who thinks that the key to the Republican comeback was splitting the difference with Obama a year ago.
Well, would it? I'm wondering about that because I think the bad economy is responsible for most of the political problems Obama's gotten into. I mean, he's a year and change in, he still doesn't even have a scandal that comes up to the level of Filegate or something. It was the White House crash was the biggest scandal, so that's what's dragging down the most. That's, I think, responsible for Republicans coming back.
Well, what about the death panels? I mean, that was a big deal. I mean, whatever the merits of the issue, it's pretty clear that Palin struck a chord. And let's face it, I should say, in 2,800 pages of legislation and 15,000 pages of regulation, the word death panels will not appear. But we all know that if you ration care, that's kind of what you wind up with. And so Palin was right in that sense, and is right. And I think that was a major negative against him. I think the doctor-patient relationship is so sacred that when Newt Gingrich said over and over again that Obama wants to put a bureaucrat between you and your doctor, he was right about that as well. And so I do think that the health care bill was a huge motivator to Republicans, and if they hadn't had that, I think Republicans would be worse off.
I mean, if they had cut some sort of compromise, and Chuck Grassley helped pass a bill in April that went as far as Rahm Emanuel wanted, not as far as Daley Coates wanted.
Yeah, I think Republicans would be worse off. Absolutely. And I think, they wouldn't have had the issue. I actually sort of, support. I have a whole blog called SeriousMedicineStrategy.org where I mostly focus on sort of medicine as opposed to the politics of health insurance. Look, what we all know in the Beltway clinch, when it is Republicans vote for something and then Democrats in the executive branch get to write the regulations and figure it all out, as they're doing now in the wake of the bill passing, that's where the mice really play. And that's where we will find, as I mentioned earlier, the medical marijuana and the sex change operations and the Viagra for prisoners and so on. All those things are either going to be written in by some crazy liberal in the bureaucracy, or litigated by, or tested out by the Medical Marijuana Society of Oakland, California. And now that's all going to happen with purely and only Democratic fingerprints. But if Chuck Grassley and 20 Republicans had voted for it, they'd be saying, "Look, they voted for this. This is exactly the kind of confusion. That would have been how you get a genuine Tea Party movement that's a third party that erupts and just blows one of the two parties away, because for all the reasons we were saying earlier about how the defense has the advantage. I mean, just think back to what we were saying, 20 minutes ago about how the blogosphere has we didn't quite finish that thought, how the blogosphere has the edge in terms of picking apart this stuff. Why would the Republicans want to share credit, if that's in a dubious achievement sense, why would the Republicans want to share credit with the Democrats for having done that? And the answer is they wouldn't. And I mean, the question is, and let's come back to this because this is a good one, is what happens, what could be done to make social welfare, you called it earlier the social democratic project, what could be done to make social welfare more workable and functional in the 21st century?
That's the question Republicans are trying to answer. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it's a question that everybody's trying to answer. The Democrats don't seem to know how to do it anymore. The Social Security Act of 1935 was 30 pages long. 30, literally, I counted one time. This thing is, as I said, was 3,000. I mean, is there something in the water? Is there something so endemic to the way that Democrats see social welfare programs that they just simply can't write something simple? And I think part of the answer is that because their real agenda is to get the sex change operations and to get the affirmative action set aside stuff in there, they need to write 3,000 pages so they can bury the stuff that they really care about in there so that they and their friends can enjoy, either the contract for doing it or just the psychic satisfaction of knowing that somewhere the government's paying for sex change operations.
The psychic satisfaction? I mean, you've been at a higher level than this, but do you think that actually is... Do you think there are discussions at one point between maybe people working for the help committee and the lobbyists for the sex change industry, for big sex change? I mean, how do you think that... I think it's just that they want to write anti-discriminatory language, but go ahead.
They would say, look, healthcare is healthcare, and, healthcare that cures cancer is an important kind of healthcare, and healthcare that helps people discover their true gender identity is also an important kind of healthcare. And I mean, look, there's much of what the government does is convey approval on behavior through money. I mean, the great example is the National Endowment for the Arts. All these piss Christs and chocolate nude covered models and things like that, they were getting, literally $5,000 from the National Endowment for the Arts. So why would the left see it as such a holy cause to make sure that the piss Christ guy gets $5,000 from the government? And the only answer I can come up with is they just understood that if the guy could do it as a matter of free speech, that was one thing. But if the government would pay for it, that was really proof that the left had won and that the right was in retreat. And that now it didn't work out that way.
Isn't the other explanation is if you're talking about big government getting involved at every level, you just don't want this Harrison Bergeron situation where you make sure that you go back and tinker and take back and you want to limit it so that everyone there's a very small package of entitlements everyone has, and this thing's controversial, so it's out, and this thing's controversial, so it's out. I mean, would that make a smaller bill?
Who was your reference? Who's Harrison Bergeron?
I mean, I'm just saying, not a perfect reference, but in the Vonnegut story, the one person, the people who have a bit more talent are shackled down.
Oh, right.
So we're all regressing the median.
So you're saying, wouldn't the Democrats have been smarter to pass a stripped-down bill?
No, I'm saying, how do you do that? How do you actually say, we're going to go out of our way to make sure that no one can get this treatment or that treatment, and that one's controversial, and that art's controversial? I mean, I think that's that was the brilliance of Social Security. If you turn 65, you get a check from the government based on as a percentage of your income. Period. That's not that complicated. But if you see Social Security as an opportunity to do X, Y, and Z on top of that. If you insist on sort of baroquing, as in baroque, up your legislation with the stuff that you really care about, I think what it boils down to is that the Democrats of today care a lot more about
sort of ratifying avant-garde positions on affirmative action or global warming or whatever than they do about actually delivering a decent health care package to some old lady in Youngstown, Ohio. I think that's the shift in the Democratic Party from 70 years ago. 70 years ago, the old lady in Youngstown, Ohio was more important, and the bohemian in New York City was less important. And now the power relationship is completely flipped. And so the lady in Youngstown, Ohio is kind of the excuse, is kind of the cover to take care of the bohemians. And of course, the people in Youngstown, the children of that hypothetical old lady, figured out and realized that yes, once again, a kind of urban college professor, Al Sharpton to George Soros liberalism has hijacked. Again, the phrase you used earlier, which I thought was a good one, is social democratic. Look, you could persuade the people in Illinois or Ohio or Pennsylvania that sort of a modified Christian democratic welfare state was okay. What you'll never persuade him of is that John Lindsay and Al Sharpton should run it.
Well, I don't think that's how they interpret this or think about it at all. I mean, you talk to high level Democrats, or at some degree, and you talk to think tankers, and certainly David Frum was he was making this cardinal sin of going to cocktail parties with people at liberal think tanks too. And if there was a secret plan, they would have come up with it. I mean, I've talked to Van Jones, and he even I've never. If he has at the root of this a Marxist,
I didn't say Marxist at all.
Let me dial back to what we were talking about. I didn't say. I said either they're very good at covering this up, or this reminds me of the way liberals thought about the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives and other things George Bush did to expand this, which was that it was all a scheme to instill James Dobson's and Rod Parsley's particular visions of morality on the rest of the country, and it wasn't. It was how can they use the tools of them as big government tools available to them as big government conservatives to make people more secure and make things more efficient. Well, forget efficient, just make everyone move everyone a couple inches closer to federal aid for these things they wanted. And liberals were sure it was there was actually a secret evangelical core all housed in C Street that had these diabolical plans that's what they were concerned with, not with welfare. I mean, I think I'm just totally naive. I think both parties start from a position of wanting to provide, to make not provide wealth. Democrats provide welfare. Republicans make sure people can be well off. But I just don't think Democrats start with that. I think it's that they do want something universal. I mean, there's a silver bullet type of liberal like a Dennis Kucinich who doesn't want any kind of carve-outs or cut-asides or make sure that affirmative action is in there. He just wants, flat single payer. Everyone, we live like Canada, and everyone pays higher taxes and gets free health care.
Right, I agree with you on Kucinich, who I think is, until he flipped on the health care bill, sort of an honest, sincere social democrat. But, let's just review Obama policy of the last year and what they've chosen to focus on. A stimulus package that didn't actually stimulate anything, because it gave money to mayors and governors, and it didn't actually, build power plants and roads and the things that you think. Yeah,
but it didn't all give it all to, Greenwich Village Social Clubs. No. It gave it to, mayors of these dilapidated towns.
Okay, yeah. but it didn't actually, it gave money to the mayors of the dilapidated towns. Yeah. Okay, it didn't pour concrete. They didn't change. And the reason it didn't do that is because the Obama administration never thought once about, for example, changing environmental regulations, about environmental impact statements and so on. So if they wanted to pour concrete, if they wanted to recreate the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Hoover Dam or LaGuardia Airport or the Golden Gate Bridge, they knew they were looking at 10 years of litigation before they got anywhere near to starting that, and they didn't bother. Now, they could have been building this up now if they'd wanted to. They just figured it wasn't worth making the environmentalists mad at them. Meanwhile, their other big push was cap and trade. cap and trade, I think you and I would agree, has zero to do with improving the lives of blue-collar workers and ordinary Americans, and everything to do with saving the polar bears, if you will, or making Barbra Streisand happy. It doesn't involve, and the proof about the green jobs, and what a fraud that was.
Yeah.
What was, you may have seen it over the weekend. The Washington Post reported that BP is closing its solar green jobs plant in Maryland and moving the jobs to China. Stone silence from the Obama administration as blue-collar green jobs disappear and go overseas. That's, again, what they really want to hear about is sort of avant-garde positions on things, and the actual reality of making life better for the average American seems to sort of have escaped them. That's not a conspiracy. That's just sort of snobbery and elitism that's so thick they can't even see below it.
Okay, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy. What you were saying, conspiracy. It's more just if you had talked to Democrats who actually think this way, because I think I
didn't say conspiracy. I specifically did not say conspiracy. I said movement. I said
movement. Yeah,
agreed upon conventional wisdom. A New Yorker cartoon view of the country.
And I was saying that liberals used to do this with the Bush administration and assume that there were backroom discussions with scary religious types who wanted. But I think here, even with cap and trade, we were talking about elitism. I think the way that environmentalists look at this is more, what is it Harry Reid said, coal is dirty. Well, that's true. It provides jobs, but we all have these, John Sayles nightmare visions of what a horrible line of work coal mining is, whereas it seems really nice to be able to employ people instead as, solar panel roof thatchers and all these jobs. And they sound goofy and glitzy, but I don't think it comes from elite. It comes from elitism in the sense that, yes, we think we know what's better for you than you do. But I think West Virginians seem to be aghast at the possibility of not coal mining as much as they used to. But liberals don't oppose it because they hate those people. They oppose it because they think it's unsustainable.
Well, they oppose it because they have higher values than jobs for coal miners in West Virginia. Their higher values are carbon and protecting mountaintops and so on. Again, if the Democratic Party were run by John L. Lewis and Robert Byrd, it would be a much different Democratic Party than the Democratic Party run by Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi.
I think there has, but that's been happening since the 60s.
True.
The takeover of the eggheads, and I think they've.
The McGovernites.
I agree with you that it's happening.
McGovernites, more precisely, but yeah.
I agree. Yeah,
right.
The McGovernites. I mean, I agree with you that this has happened. I don't think it is elitist as much as John Yoo is not an elitist because he has one view of the way presidential power should work in wartime. He really feels like he's done the research and knows better than the ACLU lawyer, and I feel like that's the way to do it. Again, I'm being really boring and naive, and I'd never survive on Fox News Watch because I'm assuming all these political actors.
No, you're entitled to, but listen, you're having real experiences that you should tell Blogging Heads fans about. For example, you wrote a headline, and what happened?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, one reason I think an app listener. An app watcher might have seen me trying to duck and turn off a cell phone because I think I'm still getting called back from a press secretary who wanted me to change a headline I wrote. And, how to make this interesting. Basically, we've had this explosion of anger over the last week, and I wrote a little bit about Eric Cantor's press conference, the whip saying he'd been threatened too. Then today...
The bullet through his window and all that.
Yeah, the bullet through his window. And then today, in Philadelphia, somebody who recorded a YouTube death threat to him, which is, I have to say, if you want to give somebody a death threat, video plus audio plus location email address. That's probably not smart. But they recorded this and got arrested, and I got a comment from his office, and I was like, oh, great, a comment from his office. Put it up with a headline that said something like, Cantor, I was informed of threat over the weekend. And got this, one of many furious calls I get in a day of somebody not liking what I did with information. And
so what did you say? What was your headline? What was the offending?
That was like Cantor. I was informed of threat over the weekend.
And what was it?
I was threatened over the weekend.
What was the problem with that? In their minds,
the problem was one that it was he didn't actually say that, but I think that's what a spokesman is for, to say something that the guy doesn't want to have time to give you on his own, and to imply that it's from him. He's a vizier for the guy, whatever. The other is that it wasn't clear, but it seemed like, I guess it was sexing up the story, and if so, that's kind of journalism. I think that's pure journalism. Obviously, is discovering a government conspiracy through hours and hours and hours of diligence and many cigarettes. But the other kind is taking information and putting it into context and making somebody want to read it. So yeah, I was getting called out for turning something into a really interesting, not salacious, that's the wrong word, but an interesting combustible story about this threat against the guy. And I'm wrestling with that kind of stuff because I don't do much opinion at all. I try to just write things about what I've reported or what I've discovered, and that leads to lots of people getting angry with the take you've put on it. And as I move over to this new job, they want lots of opinion and lots of first takes that are kind of catchy and explosive on things like this. So I anticipate many more angry calls from. So
the job of a press secretary in sort of this online world is to call up and raise hell, and because knowing that the reporter in the old days, reporters say, look, it ran in the paper this morning, tough noogies, nothing I can do about it, even if I wanted to. But now they know that you could change it with a keystroke or two. Interesting.
And they convince you that's wrong. And I think like a big story today is that the Republican National Committee, its FEC, the most anodyne way I can say it is its FEC records reveal that it paid out money to some controversial organizations like a strip club in LA. And they're working around the clock. I mean, if I can take myself out of this and put something that's happening to somebody else, this reporter at the Daily Caller who had this story is getting pilloried around town by press secretaries. I'm sure he's getting it on his end, but also people who are talking to RNC like me are informed that the guy is not telling the truth. They're pushing back, they're going to have to retract parts of it. So yeah, there's that. Actually, it's a stream of information where an aggressive press secretary who at least it's almost like a confidence game. If they catch you on something that you feel like you might have been unfair about or run without the information, then you correct it in real time and it vanishes from the internet.
Mm. So are these people, are they using Google Alerts? I mean, how do you keep track of 10,000 different media outlets? I mean,
Google Alerts. That's it. I get emails all the time from somebody who says, "Hey, that wasn't fair," or "Here's what actually happened," and the email indicates they saw it on a Google Alert. People are. This is another thing about. In addition to having cocktail parties, I think Washington also has a lot of people who Google their own names. I've never ever done that. I would.
I admit I'm on Google Alerts, and to my enormous consternation, I'm sure there's swell people, but there's two other James Pinkertons in the journalism media business. There's a reporter for the Houston paper and a TV reporter in Indiana, and they're both much more prolific than I am. And so I'm always being alerted to the story I wrote about some murder in Houston or whatever happened in Indiana, that car accident or something that happened in Indiana that day. It is, you just wouldn't, what are the chances, right? I mean, but.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, and I've been in situations where I pushed back before, but I think things are a lot more combative than they used to be. And I'm probably need to jump off and back into this stream, so I'll let you go, but can you remind everyone exactly where they can find all your stuff right now?
I write a lot for Fox News and the Fox Forum, and I have a blog at called SeriousMedicineStrategy.org, where I lay out all these healthcare things in much more detail. But you're leaving to go to the Washington Post when?
April 5th. I'll be starting there.
Very good, very good.
And I'm working out the subhead for the blog now, so if anyone reads this, I don't know who actually get to minute 48 of the blog heads, but if they want to email me a suggestion, I'd welcome it. Oh, no, well, hey, thanks so much for talking.
Thank you, Dave. We'll talk soon. All right.
Yeah,
bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Good luck. All right.